So let's talk through a whole selection of Warhammer 40K units that Games Workshop seem to have very consistently thought should never be good in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 40k units and balance, and in this video I thought it might be fun to take a look at a few of the units from Games Workshop that seem to have been notably and consistently bad throughout the last few editions. These days in Warhammer 40k I feel like things do shift around quite a lot. Games Workshop's points update system has generally updated things just about every 6 months or so over the last few years, and it seems that they might be pushing that out to 3 monthly updates in 10th edition. Since the game's big reset in 8th edition, I feel like the vast majority of units in the game have generally had their day at one point or another, and been an actual useful part in their own army if you wanted to field them, but some things definitely feel like they've just been sidelined over and over again. I thought I'd run through a few of them here and discuss why that might be the case. First up, and perhaps so consistently bad for so long that it's almost in meme territory right now, is the Orc Stompa. This thing has had a whole bunch of rules rewrites over the years, with a new datasheet and points cost in the 8th edition index, then the Orc Codex in 8th and 9th, and now a new index datasheet in 10th edition with a big toughness 14. But it seems that the common theme amongst all of those updates is that it's almost never been anywhere near something that you'd really want to take in any sort of competitive Orc list, even if it is a fairly enormous and kind of fun centerpiece for an Orc army thematically. Super heavy units do generally tend to be a little bit on the niche side within Warhammer 40k. I feel like Games Workshop in general don't usually want the optimal army for each faction just to be 3 of their super heavies stomping up the board, with the exception of Imperial or Chaos Knights, I guess. The Stompa though does seem to have had it extra unlucky. The points have always been far in excess of what it can really do in game. In general, for its size and stats, Games Workshop do tend to give it slightly better abilities than the average Imperial Knight, though maybe not really all that much once you've taken into account lack of invulnerable saves and Orky ballistic skill, but then usually tended to give it a points cost, something like an extra 50% to double the cost. As for why that is, I feel like the Orky ballistic skill 5+ that the Stompa's been tied to generally is off to a bad start. Even if Games Workshop balance the weapons for it, it can be really quite nastily affected by modifiers. Though to be honest, even with weapons being designed around that, it seems that the various detachments that have allowed it to get to ballistic skill 4+, like say using a mini-mech in the current Orc index, don't seem to get it to the point of actually being particularly that efficient. Due to the lower ballistic skill, it's generally more of a combat threat than it is a ranged threat, and that's kind of an issue given that it just often will overkill the unit that it gets to, and only moving 10 inches with an enormous base that's hard to move around terrain often means it might just not be able to reach the exact thing that it wants to. In the past, I feel like lack of a meaningful invulnerable save also hurts it a bit against dedicated anti-tank things. It does get the 6+ invulnerable save now, but it's kind of meaningless compared with its 2+ armor as you'll rarely trigger it. I kind of wonder if it might be by design that Games Workshop keeps the Stompa bad. It's kind of notable for being one of the single biggest plastic kits that they sell, and only costs around about the same amount as the much smaller Gorkanauts and Morkanauts. It really is ridiculously big on the table, towering over Imperial Knights and much bulkier, perhaps closer in size to an Orky Warhound Titan maybe. That size alone definitely doesn't help it on the board as well, as in any sort of competitive table with fairly dense terrain, it might just not be able to move between certain gaps. For its stat line in 10th edition, it does have some pretty impressive numbers. It's one of the few toughness 14 units and does get a 2+ save with 30 wounds. It is fairly durable even for the cost and is quite nice against las cannons. I think more of its issue is more that it's just going to struggle to deal enough damage to justify that 800 points. Given the ballistic skill difference, its impressive weapon stats maybe aren't all that much more impressive than, say, an Imperial Knight Crusader. And while its combat stats are good, it's going to have the problem of actually reaching the enemy army and not being move blocked by chaff units, which despite its stomping forward special rule will not really help it all that much with moving over enemy models just due to its enormous base profile. Definitely could afford to go down in points a bit this one, I think. Next up, I thought the Deathstrike missile will be worth a shout here. This one admittedly has had a recent period of actually being quite good in game with the last Imperial Guard Codex, but I feel like that perhaps only underlines just how bad it's been before and how underwhelming it is now, despite just having around about a 6-month period to shine before 10th edition came out. Again, I can see why Games Workshop have often kept this thing kind of niche. It's sort of problematic in the way that it's just an enormous tractor with a massive cruise missile. In theory, if it just operated like any other Warhammer 40k unit, you'd just have it line up on the board and then just launch an enormous missile turn 1, taking a massive chunk out of the enemy army if it's any good, and basically being probably a kind of problematic Alpha Strike type unit. It'd just add up to it being kind of auto-include if it was good enough, or utterly not worth it if the damage output wasn't good enough for the cost. Before its 9th edition targeting style rules, Games Workshop had a countdown style mechanic for it before, where you couldn't launch it turn 1, and then you'd have a progressively better chance of launching it from then on. I think it was a kind of fun idea, but it did mean that you might have your Deathstrike missile launcher not fire until turn 3 or 4, usually when it's far too late to actually influence the game in a meaningful way. With its previous damage output as well, it just wasn't really very good, nowhere near enough to justify its points cost. And in 9th edition it did have that brief period of being pretty nice. You'd have a Godspear missile launcher that actually did enough damage that the opponent had to get out of the way with units that they cared about, and you could genuinely use it to make enemies run around, perhaps particularly disrupting an enemy defensive castle hiding within a ruin so they had to try and move out and face your direct fire guns, or occasionally with the right positioning could make opponents have to choose between either holding an objective or abandoning it or not being able to move on to it. It didn't perfectly cover an objective marker, but it still covered enough that it could be very problematic. In 10th edition though, Games Workshop do seem to have reset it right back to square one really. Now the only warhead that it comes with is the Plasma Warhead, the damage 1 attacks one, and while it still has the same target adjustment type special rule, the 2d6 attacks that it's likely to generate on an enemy unit just often won't really be worth the points cost, and aren't quite enough to scare objective holding units off the points, as they might well just be able to eat all that damage and not care too much, and then basically you've wasted the primary purpose of your 160 point model. It's maybe not too far away from being good enough. I feel like a points decrease could actually make this work and be quite effective. I feel like its damage output does need to be good enough though, so your opponent actually needs to get out the way of a unit and can't just accept to take the hit, and they win out from a points trading point of view overall. Next up, and perhaps out of the Space Marine armory, along with perhaps Tactical Marines, the Primaris Reivers have just about the most consistent bad track records of being any good over the last few editions, even though Games Workshop have rewritten their rules really quite extensively several times over, and the morale system for the game has changed in quite a big way twice. I feel like just about every other Primaris troop unit has at least had some point of being really quite threatening for the cost, but Reivers I just don't think have ever got there. I feel like in competitive lists, any time over the last 6 years or so, if you saw Reivers in the list, they'd be considered a bit of a quirky edge case unit that you could try and make work if you wanted to, but most players just use something else. I feel like Reivers perhaps have multiple layers of things that mean that they're destined to be kind of niche in the Space Marine army. Their combat blades and bolt carbines generally mean that they're attacking at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1 attacks these days. And right from the start that means they're only going to be particularly effective against really quite light infantry with 3+ saves. The maximum end of their scope is going to be at killing things like enemy Space Marines with toughness 4 and a 3+ save, otherwise they're going to be really inefficient against anything tougher. It means that if you're playing against an army like Custodes or Imperial Knights with a bunch of armigers, no matter what you throw them against, you're probably sending them to their death, and those sort of armies don't respond very well to their morale shenanigans either. Talking of which, just about any special rules that tend to focus around morale have been consistently bad over the last few editions. Even in this new world of Battle Shock, they generally need something more to make them effective. Things like somehow translating it into more direct damage dealt to the unit, even above the normal Battle Shock type rules. Then just within the Space Marine unit roster, they're competing against an awful lot of flavours of various types of Space Marines with small arms or close combat weapons that kill infantry. To be one of the best picks in the list, they need to overcome things like the Intercessors or Assault Intercessors, which are generally going to have better damage and defense per point usually, given the Reivers have their extra mobility options and their morale debuffs. Scouts and the various Phobos troops are going to compete with them, and also things like the new Jump Intercessors, which can deep strike and fight quite hard in combat, or even things like Outriders for killing enemy infantry. Against some armies they genuinely can be quite good, particularly things with lots of toughness 3 infantry with bad saves and susceptible to morale, but it really doesn't seem to have come together for them so far. The 10th edition datasheet has given them a little bit of an evolution in rules. All of their attacks have gained the precision keyword, so they've got the potential to snipe characters at least. But again, just due to the damage profiles being AP 0 and damage 1 for the most part, it means that unless you're taking 10 mad squads and things, you're probably not reliably sniping marine support characters, let alone anything heavier in Terminator armor or something. As I've had a fair few people point out in previous videos, perhaps one of the most interesting things you can do with them in the current codex is to deep strike them with a Phobos lieutenant and use his reactive move to set up a really close range charge. It does mean that you can have a fairly impressive amount of these attacks with lethal hits coming out of deep strike and really quite easily winning a battle against some light infantry. If you are placing that much value in a unit though, you really could have taken something that's heavier hitting that is a good damage dealer against the general field as well though. Even that setup might compare a bit poorly with, say, a whole bunch of Jump Intercessors coming in with rapid ingress. Over to the Tomb Worlds now, and I feel like one character that's been a letdown for a long time for the Necrons is Trazyn the Infinite. I feel like he's a bit of an annoying matchup between expectations and reality, given that he's perhaps one of the single coolest Necron characters in the lore, showing up to meddle in conflicts and war zones that don't really concern him, always aiming to expand his collection, perhaps something that Warhammer collectors can particularly identify with. Over his various rules incarnations, he's basically been let down by two things. First up, his Empathic Obliterator just seems to have a history of being subpar compared with other Necron melee choices, usually getting some sort of fun rule but generally having bad AP and comparing awfully to things like War Scythes. And then his primary special ability generally tends to be that when he dies, he gets to assume control of surrogate hosts when he's about to be slain, taking another Necron character on the board and basically replacing him with Trazyn. That generally means that you're often just replacing one mediocre Necron character like a Royal Warden or a Lord or something with one that isn't really all that much more valuable in Trazyn, and it's kind of questionable whether it's worth using that surrogate host ability at all, rather than let the poor Lord or Royal Warden just get on with what they were trying to do with their own buffs. At the moment he is at least fairly cheap, and given that his melee isn't particularly standout and the surrogate host thing is questionable, the only real big thing that he adds is taking an objective and making it a sticky objective in your command phase. Definitely handy enough to an objective that's about to get wiped out by enemy shooting or something, but I'm not sure that ability alone is really worth the 75 points versus the goodness that either a Lord or an Overlord can bring. Not getting a Resurrection Orb certainly doesn't help him as well. I feel like he just needs to be able to do something that's a bit more interesting while he's alive to actually make that surrogate host rule pretty annoying when he pops up somewhere else. For the Custodies, perhaps one of the most niche units in their roster over and over again are the Vigilators. These girls are the Sisters of Silence with Executioner Great Blades, a whole bunch of Strength 5 and Damage 2 melee attacks normally, which just generally tends to fall into the kind of unfortunate category that it's just very similar damage than most of the standard Custodies tend to do. Compared with, say, the Prosecutors, with their fairly low threat bolt guns, the Vigilators do tend to pay a premium for the actual melee ability that they have, while perhaps not really adding a lot more to the Custodians roster compared with just things like standard Custodian Guard Wardens or Alorus Terminators, all of which tend to have fairly similar marine killing damage profiles, and all of those tend to get a lot more support in terms of Codex special rules and stratagems and things compared with the Vigilators. Then instead of being a very tanky unit that you can throw into melee and overwhelm the enemy with critical mass, the Vigilators are really quite fragile, so if you throw them into an enemy unit and they can't quite handle them, a few of them survive and they might get hit back very, very hard and lose a good portion of your squad on your own turn. It just means that their damage has to be kind of excessive if you want to justify taking them over a big unit of Custodians that's got a lot of defensive might as well. Then if you're using them for a bit more of a small unit role, then in general the Prosecutors have tended to be cheaper throughout the editions due to the lower threat of their bolt guns. It means that they're far more efficient as just a placeholder unit for taking objectives or doing any anti-psyker support should that be necessary, and the Witch Seekers have often been the next thing to choose after that, with things like Scouts or the Torrent weapons for some actual genuinely threatening shooting, plus Overwatch. The data sheet for them at the moment does have them hit really quite hard against Psykers specifically. Anti-Psyker 4+ and Devastating Wounds could be pretty brutal against, say, a Demon Primarch, for example. But I feel like beyond situations like that, they're just not going to be most efficient against the vast majority of the field, and a lot of armies in 40k don't have Psykers at all. They perhaps feel like they're in the weird place where they need to be only very, very fractionally more than the standard Sister of Silence with Bolters if they're going to get looked at in the index. Back to the Imperial Guard once more, and another unit that's just had a fairly aggressively bad history are the Ogryns. Again, throughout many editions of the Guard Codex, they've just been very, very weak and lackluster for the points cost. Though I'd actually say with their 10th edition datasheet they're much better than usual, at least their Ripper guns pack an appreciable punch now when they really didn't in the past. I think their issues is again that their damage output is sort of middling. Generally it's usually been medium strength and maybe AP-1 at range and melee, meaning that they're fairly good into light or medium infantry, but just won't do anything against vehicles or things with thick armour like Terminators, at least in the previous editions of the game. Beyond that, they've tended to have at least fairly good toughness. They're toughness 6 and 3 wounds at the moment with a feel no pain, but with reasonable toughness but low armour, they're sort of in another awkward spot, because it means that when they're fairly cheap, they do tend to absorb a fair bit of fire, but still almost literally every weapon in the game is at least fairly effective against them, whether it's volume fire from bolt shots or some anti-tank weapons to take out entire big models in one big shot. On top of that, auxiliary units tend to have less support from core rules and stratagems than most of the rest of the Guard Index, and time and again over the last few editions it's generally been better to field Ogryns instead of them, as they get better armour and different variants of shield. meaning that even if they cost a fair few more points, they generally tend to be tougher per point, and that might be the most important thing when you've got a slow-moving Death Star walking up the board. Admittedly, in 10th edition, now they've dropped down to 65 points, I feel like this is one of the best incarnations that Ogryns have had in a while. While still hitting on 4s, their Ripper Guns do admittedly get a pretty decent punch if you can get them within 9-inch range. 6 shots at Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 2 is really quite good if you can get them there. Perhaps could be okay with the new and cheap Chimeras, and they still have some okay threat in melee as well, with a bunch of Strength 6 and AP 1 attacks. Overall, for their points for their stats at the moment, I don't really feel that they're too bad, but it's kind of crazy that they need to get this cheap in points cost before people generally think about taking them in more competitive lists. Next up, and back to the Tomb Worlds once more, we've got the great big hunk of living metal that is the Obelisk. This one's the dual build for the Tesseract Vault, an alternative space pyramid to the Monolith, but basically just seems to have been absolutely awful for about as long as it's existed, though it seems that just being tough alone isn't enough to justify a super heavy, it would seem. Again, the same as the Stompa, this one probably partly suffers from Games Workshop just not really considering super heavy as a priority to be very good within an army. I think it would be a bit disappointing if every Necron army decided just to run 3 of these, but again, even compared with the other big super heavies, it's just been worse than normal for the vast majority of its lifespan. It is tough for the cost, as it generally tends to be quite cheap as it doesn't really pose much threat, and then it only attacks with the Tesla orbs, which are designed to be good against lighter infantry, but it doesn't really come with a big gun to threaten enemy units that are either well armoured or are vehicle type targets. And most of the time in Warhammer 40K, if you're taking an enormous unit on the board, it needs to be able to pose at least some threats to enemy big threats, say the Monolith with its particle whip and death rays, or the Tesseract Vault with its choice of big powerful attacks. On top of that, the lore for it is that it has a gravity well that tends to affect enemy flying units near it, causing them to take damage if they do happen to wind up too close. Again, maybe like things like the Reivers, it just tends to be a bit of a specific special rule that is only good against certain armies, but entirely useless against others. And perhaps for a similar sort of reason, it just generally tends to threaten lighter infantry and not anything else, and then have special rules that only affect a subset of enemy armies. It means that it's rarely going to be a good idea to take one. Here's the 10th edition profile for it. It's 325 points for admittedly quite a tough machine with toughness 14 and 22 wounds. Those Tesla spheres do put out really quite a lot of attacks, but they're all at strength 7 and damage 1. And anti-fly 4+ is generally still not going to be enough to seriously threaten enemy fly vehicles if they're not getting any AP. The anti-fly thing is also kind of short-ranged as well, only 18 inches for a thing that moves pretty slowly, and just slows them down a little bit and gives them a coin flip chance to take some damage. Sometimes it might matter, a lot of the time it might really not. Let me know what you think of the units though, and what things have generally tended to hold them back over the editions. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. Feel free to tell me any other units that you think should have really been on this list as well. There's definitely plenty of others that I could have mentioned. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.